and the conversation today is Building Black Wealth with U.S. Banks, with U.S. Bank, excuse me. Conversation with Greg Cunningham and Gunjan Kedia. Today, building wealth and achieving financial security is a primary aspiration for most, but many communities face distinct challenges in reaching these goals. As advisors who work every day to help clients achieve better financial outcomes, U.S. Bank's Greg Cunningham and Gunjan Kedia understand that our industry has an important role to play in closing the racial wealth gap. Now, we must start by listening and learning from the customers and communities. Gunjan Kedia, Vice Chair, Wealth Management and Investment Services, and Greg Cunningham, Chief Diversity Officer, discuss the results of U.S. Bank's recent survey to better understand the financial needs, goals, and challenges of Black Americans with at least $25,000 in investable assets, and what surprised them and what U.S. Bank plans to do with the better results. I'll be moderating this talk, so please help me welcome Greg and Gunjan. Welcome both.
Thanks, Hunter. How are you? Good to see you.
I'm good. It's good to see everyone on camera. We're in our offices today, our home offices. We're looking snazzy. How y'all doing today?
Well, thank you for your good cheer, Hunter. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. Well, it's a really pleasure to see you both. Thank you for making the time. If we could start off, just if you could let me know and our viewers know a little bit about yourself and your career journeys so far. Greg, we can start with you.
Yeah, thank you, Hunter. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm Greg Cunningham, as Hunter had stated. I've been with the bank for just about 6 years now, after having spent the bulk of my career as a marketing executive in the retail space with Target Corporation. Really excited to be here, and I would be remiss, Hunter, if I didn't start by, and I know we're jumping into it, but I want to also just sort of acknowledge the police shooting that occurred here in Minneapolis, not far from our headquarters, literally about 3 blocks from our headquarters, the shooting of Amir Locke. And so that theme, I know, will carry out. There's portions of it that I think are important for us to acknowledge. And so I wanted to acknowledge that before we went any further, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Greg. Gunjan.
Thank you, Hunter. It's my pleasure to join you as well. I have to tell you and your audience that Greg and I are literally sitting next to each other, although we look like we are calling in from completely different locations. So I have been at U.S. Bank for about 5 years, but I've had a 30-year career in financial services, in many parts of financial services, but all of it comes down to trying to create better outcomes financially for our clients at whatever level of affluence they are in. And we are very pleased actually to be spotlighting in our conversation with you today the affluent Black segment, people who have accomplished enormous success despite some challenges, as we'll talk about. So thank you for hosting us and looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, it's really an honor to have you both here. If we can jump right in, we have 25 minutes to talk about some pretty big stuff here. So if we could start by going right to it, can you tell us, Greg, maybe if you'd like to speak to how I think we're all aware, but maybe you can speak to the details of how the deep-rooted systemic inequalities and racial gaps are in the realm of the finance world.
Yeah, thanks, Hunter. It's a great question. And they do run deep, and they run deep in our society as a whole. And you really have to look at it from a historical perspective, Hunter. These wealth disparities that are so persistent didn't happen by accident. There is a long history of policies and practices that were adopted to keep African Americans out of the financial system and to keep them from advancing economically. And the real tragedy of that, Hunter, and the real work to be done, you cannot separate racial justice from economic justice. It's impossible. You have to have both. And I fundamentally believe in this notion that truth and reconciliation are sequential. And in order for us to make progress, we actually have to come to terms with what happened and how the systemic policies were both adopted and condoned throughout history that got us to this point. So this work that we're doing is really an honest attempt to bring our core competency to this notion of closing the racial wealth gap. And the work that Gunjan and I are partnered on is really just one step in that process of really thinking about what we can do as a financial services institution to change the outcomes. And I underscore outcomes because this work is not about activity. And I'll talk a little bit later about some of this stuff and how we're going to measure our progress and how we're going to publicly release our measurement framework so the public can hold us accountable. But this work really is about outcomes. It's not about activity, Hunter. And I think this notion of having an honest assessment of history and how we got here is the first step in the process towards reconciliation.
Yeah, I love that you're already helping us focus towards the outcomes of what we can hope to do and we'll hear more in this conversation about what y'all are doing at US Bank to help achieve those outcomes. Gunjan, would you like to speak on that topic before we move on to different questions?
We should move on. The fact is the disparity is very real, whether you look at income, whether you look at wealth. And, a lot of times Greg and I are asked why we have chosen to focus this particular research at this time on the affluent Black segment. And I would say that the disparities are the most challenging here. So if we can make progress here, we would have a blueprint to help every community here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, speaking to certain specific communities, and as we're in the past almost 2 years now, as we're going through the global pandemic, which is still going on, I think it's fair to say, maybe you can disagree, but I think it's fair to say that that the wealth and achievement and financial security is of extreme importance right now, because there's been a lot of people that have been impacted even harder. It was already hard before, and now it's even harder in these unprecedented times. So what are some of the ways in which this achievement and these outcomes that you were speaking about earlier can be achieved, especially for the Black community and other underrepresented groups? Gunjan, can you speak on this topic?
Yeah, the COVID era has been quite surprising, and our survey captured some very interesting and different findings. So one, just to sort of level set, a couple of very foundational insights that we had from the researchers for your audience. When you look at what wealth means for an affluent Black community member, they talk a lot about its impact on their community. It was very startling to us that 4 times as many respondents who were Black said that they want to use their wealth to make a difference to their community. So here we are looking at a very different mindset and very different relationship with money that a person might have. What we found within the COVID world is that on one end of the spectrum, there were people who had real hardship because of the pandemic. They lost childcare support. They were running a small business. And as you know, small businesses were devastated through the COVID because people were not going into offices. But on the other side, there's also a segment of people who have done better through COVID. They've been able to work in work arrangements that didn't require commute. If they had investable assets and they were invested, the stock market returns have been very, very good. They've been able to pay down debt because the spend patterns have been low. Their credit card bills went down. They got a little bit of relief from rent pressures. So we are really seeing a dichotomy here. In fact, our survey would show 61% of our respondents said they feel better. So this is the essence of what we have to capture here, understanding that there are very different outcomes that have been experienced because of the COVID, and what it is that we can do to channel the community spirit of the affluent Blacks to lift the whole community.
Yes, Greg.
This is a really important insight, Hunter, because what Gunjan is highlighting is a really important insight that is so pervasive in the Black community. And that's this dichotomy that Gunjan talked about, where you may have had individual success, and Black Americans disproportionately have this sense, and the research validated it. You may have individual success, but you don't feel successful if the people around you and your community is still suffering. And it's an unusual and unique burden that African Americans in this country carry, is because you not only represent yourself. Maya Angelou has a really famous quote, and she says, "I came as one, but I stand as 10,000." Like, you have a whole community that is looking to you, and your individual success really is less important than how well is the community around me doing as well.
Yeah, I think that is a really important point and to bring up, and especially in a culture, for me, in my experience, I was definitely brought up with like, you got to succeed, you got to do this, you got to do that. And it's like, there isn't necessarily a focus from, you know,
Yeah.
success isn't necessarily defined by bringing up the people around you. I think I had this warped version of success as a kid that's like, well, if you're rich and famous, then you nailed it, but like that
Yeah.
doesn't have anything to do with anybody else. And that's actually not, we talk to those people at the top, they're kind of sad and lonely, because then it's the awakening later that's like, oh, I need to help other people. That's really important. I think
it is very important. I'll add to that because, as wealth advisors, as financial advisors, we have to be very in tune with what a customer is defining as success, because it's their life, it's their goals and dreams. You're talking about responsibility to the community today. They are also very focused on leaving a legacy for the next generation. So most of, just like you were describing, most of us don't start thinking about leaving till you're older. But what we're finding with affluent Black advisors is day one, they're thinking about what can they leave to the next generation. So things like transferable assets, things like planning for transfers is so much more relevant to this investor group early on than we see in others. So truly a different mindset of what success looks like.
Yes, absolutely. And we mentioned when we were describing what U.S. Bank has been up to, there's talk about the survey that was conducted. Can we talk about what are the results that was found in the survey, and how can it help Black individuals to attain financial stability? The results from this survey.
Greg, you want me to start, or you want to start?
Yeah. I'll just start with a couple of things that I observed that I think are important, and then Gunjan, I know, will be able to speak specifically about the details of it. But there were three really important insights, Hunter, that emerged from the survey, and two of them we've talked about: this notion of community, and this sense of, it's not just about me; it's about my entire community. The second one that Gunjan talked about was this notion of generational wealth. Most Blacks don't start with, they don't start starting from a very different place. Many of us weren't handed any assets to begin with, because of all of the disparities that we talked about. And so when you finally do start to have a little bit of financial success, it's important to you, disproportionately more important to this Black consumer, to say that I'm actually having the next generation start from a very different place than I did. The third thing that's really important, that's probably not going to be a surprise, Hunter, is representation really matters. It was really important to these respondents that they actually saw financial advisors who shared their lived experience, that there were Black and women financial advisors, because this whole process is a very scary, mysterious process for Black Americans. Like, there's a huge trust gap between the community and the financial services in general. And so stepping into this, when you aren't sort of, exposed to these conversations as a young person, it's all very foreign and scary to you. And so this notion of representation helps to demystify all of it. And it actually gives a level of credibility and helps to close that trust gap. So those are just a couple of things, Hunter, that I would point out. And Gunjan, I'll let you share more.
The process was very interesting to us. Before we did the mathematical survey, which was 5,000 respondents, it was a very significant survey. We had 3 or 4 roundtables with trusted advisors of our own. Some of them were our employees, some of them were our clients, some of them were our community partners. And they guided us in terms of what kind of questions to ask. And one of the theme of trust was really something we explored in these listening sessions to craft our questions, because we were trying to say, well, what does that really mean? And it did come down in the survey to the most important thing you can do to generate trust is representation. They need to see themselves in the person that they are talking to. So that was a very, very important insight. And I'll just compare that. We did a very extensive survey for women and wealth 2 years back. And that theme did not come out in the women's service. We did not hear women investors say that they must have somebody who's a woman. They wanted somebody who understood them. But this was different for this community. So we are taking that certainly very seriously in terms of making sure that we are pairing up the right clients with the right advisors.
I love that. It can just be it's really about what I'm hearing is connecting and the dispelling the trust, creating the trust gap, like dispelling the gap and creating the trust is really a unique scenario per client and per person. And it's encouraging to hear that you're taking the time to really, because like you said, Greg, it can be a really confusing and scary place of just like putting all my financials in one place and signing up for stuff. And what are they going to do? Is this going to get to somewhere else? I have all these thoughts that go through my head when I'm applying for a credit card, and like, so and that's like, that's the easiest thing, right? But it's can be overwhelming at times. So it's encouraging to hear that y'all are finding ways to really help people get access and create that trust.
And to put a fine point on that, Hunter, before you move on, because it ties back to where we started the conversation about the history. The history is not good. The reason there's a trust gap is because of the experience that the community has had with these institutions. So it's all connected.
Well, yeah, like you said at the top, this it didn't happen by accident. I think that's what you said, right? It is deep rooted in our history. We're getting a bunch of questions here from the audience, which I'm going to get to as many of them as we can. And while we're on the topic of the survey, we had a question: is there a summary of the study's findings that can be shared publicly? Is that something that our listeners can see?
Definitely, and thank you for your interest, because we are the survey is public. We can certainly make it available through you, or if you just come to usbank.com, you'll be able to find the survey. And we appreciate your interest in it and your feedback on it, because insights are developed progressively over time. One thing leads to another conversation. So yes, please tune in to usbank.com and search for the survey.
Great, thank you for that resource. I have a couple questions from, forgive me, participant if I mispronounce your names, Sonja. First, they asked earlier, would you say, and when we were talking about the pandemic, some people did better and some people did much worse. Would you say that the gap is widening, or I'm going to abridge their question a little bit? Is it widening or is it getting closer? The wealth gap. And their follow-up question, I think is related here, is how has the increase of affluent BIPOC folks impacted the wealth gap? Some big topics there, so I'll let you go from there.
Hunter, what I would say about the COVID gap is the societal response to an extraordinary pandemic was something we should all feel good about. In this world when nothing feels good very much, we should feel good about it. And I'll just put a mirror to the financial services industry in a very honest way. In 2009, when a financial crisis hit the industry, the response was to double down on the companies themselves. There were mass layoffs, there were tightening of credit standards. But think about what happened with banks this time around. there was widespread forbearance programs that the entire industry offered, and that's all that people really needed was a few months of grace before the government programs, before programs like PPP for the small businesses showed up. So, in conclusion, I would say it has been a good time because our societal response has been good. But there is a segment of the population that has been very impacted. Women have left the workforce, especially in roles in jobs that required you to come in, not the white collar jobs that you could do from the comfort of your sitting room. But if you were a young single mom and you lost your childcare, or your elderly mom was watching and you did not want to bring back germs or viruses to you really struggled. So I would say the affluent members of the community have a huge role to play in restoring some balance here, and that's something we are certainly thinking about. At some point, if Greg gets a chance to talk about access commitment, we are very thoughtful about the impact to those subsets of the communities through the pandemic that just need attention.
Yeah, and Hunter, what I would add, if I could take 30 seconds to talk about what Gunjan mentioned, this access commitment was an initiative, a bank-wide initiative we launched back in February of 2021, and it really seeks to do three things. Number one, it's a focus on our employees and creating leadership and advancement opportunities for employees. Number two, it's focused on catalyzing resources towards small businesses so that those businesses can grow and scale and create jobs. Because as we all know, Hunter, the best social program is a job. And so if we can help these businesses grow, that builds vitality in our community. And then the third area is the investment in communities and families. And that's a big part of the work that we're doing with Gunjan and her team in the wealth management space. And I would just add, Hunter, one of the other foundational things that's really important to talk about as we talk about wealth, and the question about is the gap closing. I would just sort of point people to look at statistics like the home ownership gap as an example. The home ownership white households, 75% of white households in this country own their own home. The number is 44% for black households. The number is not getting smaller. It's not closing. And so these are foundational things. And that's the number one way that wealth gets transferred in this country is through home ownership. And so these are the kinds of issues that we are digging in on to really sort of begin to address this issue, which is not a black problem or a Hispanic problem, by the way. The wealth gap is an American problem. It affects every single one of us as Americans. And so we all have a vested interest in seeing these gaps close. That was more than 30 seconds. I apologize.
That was very helpful and insightful, though. Worth all the extra 20 seconds, I would say. I'm getting more questions from the audience here. I love the engagement, and I really I'm grateful for this. And I'm going to combine some of these questions a bit. And so what I'm getting from the audience, I'm curious too, from our listeners, our participants, I'm curious too, or what are some of the actual things that are going on behind the scenes that are helping people get access to, especially folks of color, to alleviate some of these deep-rooted systemic discriminatory policies? What are things that are going on maybe at US Bank, or that other things that you're noticing within the financial community that are helping to alleviate these problems that just are persistent?
Let me start because that's a very good question and goes to our mindset of outcomes, which we very much are empathetic with the audience that at some point it's not just facts and data. What are you doing about it? The first thing I would say is education. There are more resources available than people really realize. To me, as a banker, it was very clear very early on when the government started, for example, the Paycheck Protection Program. A vast majority of the small businesses in this country are Black owned, but we weren't seeing Black owned participants come for what was essentially free loans from the government to help you through. And that comes down to education. Do you trust the person you're talking to give you good advice that you can act on to improve your own outcomes? During our listening sessions, we heard this phrase over and over again, and it says, each one reach one. or each one teach one. And it was the community's way of helping the rest of the communities. So we have sort of created a program called Each One Teach One, where we have our Black advisors mentor other Black advisors so that we increase the total numbers of people that the community would trust with good advice. So that those are the type of things that we are doing to spotlight the resources that are available to the community that may be distrusted or maybe not understood as well as they could be.
And those advisors, Hunter, to the person, thank you for the question. It's a wonderful question. Those advisors, that sort of advice and support is how I would describe it, is also playing itself out in other parts of our business too. We're actually putting in many of our branches. In fact, here in our North Minneapolis branch, we have a business access advisor, who really serves as a resource for small businesses who come in and want to understand how do they get access to this capital that they need. Again, how do we demystify that process? To Gunjan's point, education is a critical piece of this. And so you've got to localize that support and you've got to make it really personal. So that's one of the things that we're doing. And the other thing I'd mention very briefly is making sure that we are supporting those third-party intermediaries. When I think about for small businesses, the role that minority deposit institutions play, Black banks specifically. We've been mentoring a Black-owned bank since 2019 through the Department of Treasury's program, and then getting resources to those community development financial institutions, because everyone can't walk into a U.S. bank and get a business loan or get a loan. And so these third-party institutions are able to catalyze resources into the communities in ways that U.S. Bank wouldn't be able to. And we've been supporting them financially through our Access Fund. So those are just a couple of things that we're doing to provide additional support.
I'll add one more, which Greg, you introduced to the bank, and it was so powerful, is we looked at our policies around vendors that we buy from. And there were some size limits for who we would do business with. And we realized that just that simple metric was leaving a lot of Black-owned businesses out. So we hosted, it was probably a year back now, right? We hosted this learning session for anyone interested in doing business with US Bank to give them support on how the administrative process of being approved as a vendor would work so that they could sort of be part of our system as well. And that was also, I think it was a very successful initiative in trying to sort of create opportunity in a slightly different way by just rethinking how we think about vendor engagement.
Well, clearly we could talk about this all day and we're already out of time, but I hope we get to have you back at some point and talk more to continue these conversations. Just hearing about, the community aspects, the outcome, the trust gaps, there's the actionable steps that y'all are taking. So I really appreciate you sharing your wisdom, sharing your experience with us, and leaving us, it sounds like, for me, I'm left with a little bit of hope from this conversation. And so thank you for making the time today. Is there a way that the audience can connect to you? Are you on LinkedIn, or any resources you'd like to share as we're wrapping up?
Yeah, LinkedIn for sure. And I'm G Cunningham 1 on Twitter as well.
Likewise.
Great.
Thank you, Hunter.